Hi friends. So today I thought we could talk a little bit about you don't graduate from growing up in life, so why would we think that we would graduate from growing up in the faith? We don't ever stop growing and learning as human beings in this world, about this world and how to live in this world and how to better ourselves in this world. We never stop those lessons, right? They're always coming at us, whether we choose them or we don't choose them. So why would we think then that we would never stop learning the lessons of faith and bettering ourselves, not just for this world, but for the world to come? Let me flesh this out in an analogy. It's something that's familiar to all of us, and it's growing up in a family. Whatever shape or form, good or ill, great or bad, whatever, we all were affected by growing up in families, right? So when a child graduates, let's say the child graduates from kindergarten or 8th grade or high school or college, we throw a graduation party and we congratulate the child. But what about the parent? I mean, we spend so much time congratulating and heaping accolades and attaboy, attagirl upon the student, and rightly so, because graduation is quite the accomplishment. But what about congratulating the parents? I mean, think about it for a moment. Because we live in a fallen world, we are not naturally inclined to the virtue of work. Work, in fact, the scriptures tells us from the book of Genesis, is a curse that is placed upon us after the fall of Adam and Eve. So it's not something that we just grow up with that inclination. No, it's a learned trait, right? Another thing to keep in mind is that we don't grow up with the virtue of discipline. What's discipline? I'm not talking about disciplining a person because they've done bad. I'm talking about shaping and forming a person over the course of years so that person becomes the person that they were always meant to become. Yes, parents contribute to that, but eventually the child, as he or she is growing up, has to take on self-discipline. But how can they ever learn self-discipline unless they are first disciplined? Remember again, discipline means to be a student of a master who's teaching you a way of life. Not in the negative sense I'm talking about, but very much in the positive sense. So we don't grow up with that natural inclination of self-discipline. No, that's something that we're taught. And these things we're taught, some better than others in families, from our moms and our dads. They're the ones who teach us how to be disciplined in our studies. How many times, for instance, did you hear growing up, or do you remember telling your children, you can't do X, Y, or Z until you do your homework? That's a form of being focused and of strengthening the will and focusing the intellect and the work ethic that goes along with that to accomplish the goals that are given to us from day to day. So parents are the ones who pass on this disciplined way of life. I mean, think about it, just in one more example. How many hours across years do parents spend with their children teaching them math and science and literature? Yes, they're in a class and they learn the principles of math, but then they got to come home and do exercise after exercise after exercise so that they can learn those principles in practice, right? The same with science. They're given a science project and they come home and guess who helps them? Mom and dad, you know? Or getting into the intricacies of a classical piece of literature, or learning to appreciate the causes of the Civil War. And the list goes on like that. It's mom and dad sitting down with children over many, many years and just countless hours of discipling their children, of taking them as students and making them into people who are masters in these areas, so that they can graduate, so then that they can go out into the world and what? Stop? No. Go. Go out into the world and make a life for themselves, make an impact upon this world, be able to care for themselves and care for other people. This is what parents selflessly dedicate themselves to for many, many years. I give that example because I think of the early church. And in the early church, that's where and when we as priests started being called fathers in what's called the apostolic age and the post-apostolic age. So like in the time of the Acts of the Apostles, for instance, when they're written. And then the generations after that, in the first about 500 years of the church, it's when the leaders of the church were given a name that's familiar to us, Father. And why? Because the very things that we just talked about in regards to us growing up, or growing up our families and discipling them, disciplining them, getting them ready for the world, is exactly what the leaders of the church, and again, not just the leaders, like the priests, but ultimately moms and dads and catechists and aunts and uncles and grandparents. That's what all of them contributed to in the early church. So an example of that I mentioned is Acts of the Apostles. Just go to like Acts 11. And it's a story of how Barnabas, one of the apostles, is sent from the church in Jerusalem up to Tarsus to get Paul, gets Paul, or at that time he was named Saul, St. Paul, and they go to Antioch and they spend a whole year there. The Acts of the Apostles tells us, Luke tells us, spends a whole year there. And what happens, Luke records that many people were brought to the Lord through the fathering, through the teaching, through the formation that Barnabas and St. Paul gave to this community that didn't know Christ. And St. Luke records in the Acts of the Apostles that it is in Antioch that the people who were following Christ were first given the name Christian. But that's what the church did for centuries, is it went to unchristian areas, areas that have never known Christ, and it established communities. Let's call them what they were, families, very intimate families in a geographical region. And a father figure stepped forward and he started discipling. He started disciplining. He started shaping and molding, started giving them a measure for their lives. And the church grew like wildfire in those centuries. All the way up to our modern time, when out of nowhere, it seems, but there's a history there, this church stopped growing. Why? Because somewhere along the way, two things happened for us as Christians. We started thinking that once we reached a certain age, let's say a chronological age, we no longer needed to be discipled. And also, that once we arrived at being an adult, we no longer needed to disciple others. Or maybe not even adults. Maybe the problem is that long before adulthood, we were never taught to be disciples and disciple others. And yet, the whole history of our church and the very infrastructure and nature and mission of a family speaks otherwise. And we really have to step back and think about that for a few moments for our lives, right? We have so many of our family members, I hear this so often as a priest, where the child who's now an adult no longer practices his or her faith. Well, the moment that a mother or a father stops paying attention to a critical area like the education of their children, the moment that they stop sitting down with them and spending countless hours, grueling hours in some respects, especially I think for the parents, but also for the kids, right? Of disciplining them, of discipling them in education, in math, in history, and science, and so on, is the moment that child is in peril. Because it's not enough for that child simply to go to a school and have a teacher, right? They have to then take what they learn in the school and bring it back and do homework, right? Well, we've stopped doing homework with our children in regards to an education that is far more important for preparing them, not just for this world, a fallen world to live in and how to navigate that, but preparing them to live in the next world, and more importantly, where to live in the next world, like heaven, as opposed to hell. And so we've got to do that homework with our children and not abdicate it to the teachers at an institution alone. But the opposite of that is true too. In order to do that, we have to, as adults, move out of this mode that we learn in our education system of graduating, of having arrived, and therefore never having again to pick up another book. And I'm not talking about a book on classical literature or a novel. I'm talking about the book of life. I'm talking about the book of eternal life, right? That we never graduate from learning how to be a human being and how to better ourselves as human beings. And so why would we stop or think that we can graduate from learning how to be a Christian and how to continue to grow and mature as a Christian? What I'm getting at is that we as adults, and long really before we're adults, when we're in high school, when we're in college, when we're in middle school, we have to always remember that we are forever students. We're forever disciples. And that we always need to be disciplined. Again, not in the negative sense, but in the positive sense. We always need to be presented a measured way of life, a rule of life, a way of life, a goal in life, with goals and objectives and action plans, and with plenty of homework to be done. And that's part of what, going back to the Acts of the Apostles, we learn from the early church. They didn't do it alone. They formed communities, families, if you will, religious families. And in those religious families, they were being discipled all the way up to the time that they take their last breath, and long before that as they take their first breath, and everything in between. And along the way, they were discipling one another. That's why church and being part of church and being a member of a family of a church is so absolutely essential. It is irreplaceable. And yet, there are many of us who are out in the world learning all kinds of things, and it hasn't dawned upon us, or we've lost that dawn, that enlightenment, that ray of light that teaches us the great truth, that we need a family. And we need a family for both things. We need a family so that we're forever discipled. And we need a family so that we have all the stuff that we need in order to disciple others, most especially that we do homework with, the ones we do homework with every day of our lives. And not just when they graduate from our homes, right? But when they start forming families and start having children. How much more then do they need a father and a mother and a grandmother and grandfather? And I'm not talking about babysitting. I'm talking about a teacher in the ways of faith that will teach them how to be self-disciplined, how to be discipled, so they then can pass that on to their children, your grandchildren, and that's how the church grows. And that's how the church will grow again. Until next time, friends.